You're ready.
Turretinfan seems to indicate that since you can't pinpoint a decade or a precise time of an ancient event, that it indeed cannot be correct. Turretinfan's theological flaws here are quite simple. Well, can you name when the last book of the Bible was written? Can you name the exact time that Christ preached certain of his parables? You get the point. Historical truths are attested to by witnesses throughout time. A precise time is not needed for historical truth to be valid. Turretinfan is also incorrect. Pseudo-Melito is not the first time where you hear of Mary's Assumption. The Book of Mary's Repose is labeled as much earlier than this, and even that, scholars tell us, points to a tradition and belief held by the apostolic Christians. We see that, whereas we have apocryphal accounts detailing Mary's Assumption, they have seemingly been borrowed from Orthodox Christian teaching. This can be evinced in the fact that the Feast of the Assumption has been celebrated since the 400s. Indeed, this feast can also be traced to Palestine, dating before the 500s, as well as in Gaul in the 500s. If one were to study the Gallican liturgy of the early Christians, we'd find that the Assumptio was a major feast. The Assumption was a major feast. Feasts in Rome are dated from the 600s as well, and one of the main feasts was that of the Assumption, celebrated in Rome. What we can see is that Reformed theology has made it a constant in their teaching to slowly move away from the teaching of the early church. We saw it in our Mary, Mother of God debate, where the testimony of the fathers was unanimous in calling Our Lady the Mother of God. We then saw it in our perpetual virginity debate, where even Turretinfan's namesake held to this dogma. Indeed, ancient Protestantism held to a number of the Marian dogmas, but as time has gone by, these beliefs have been eroded by modern theological views that have overridden the previous ones. Thank God that in Catholicism an authority greater than man resides. The teachings that have been set in stone by God remain there until the end. As far as patristic proofs go, in his debate years back against the former Catholic Mr. White of AOMIN, says that there is no proof for the Assumption of Mary for the first 1,000 years of the Church. But is what AOMIN actually say hold water? If we examine the Book of Mary's Repose, dated as early as the 200s, we find an ancient work that comes to us in Ethiopic and later on is translated into various languages. There are various scholars that argue for a Greek original and some that merely posit that it originally was composed in Ethiopic. This ancient work indeed tells us, when Mary heard from the Lord that her body would die, a great angel came to her. Moving forward, we read, "For I will send all the apostles to you, and they will prepare your body for burial, and they will see your glory and will not depart from you until they bring you to where you were before." Moving forward in this work, we read Mary's words to God as, "For if it is so, tell me, so that I can do this, and you will come to me and take me up." And he said to her, "What is the matter, mother? For I have been sent to you. I will not come to you alone, but with all the hosts of angels." Moving on to the 300s, we have an unknown Christian, sometimes labeled as Pseudo-Melito, writing, "If therefore it might come to pass by the power of your grace, it has appeared right to us, your servants, that as you, having overcome death, do reign in glory, so you should raise up the body of your mother and take her with you, rejoicing into heaven." This early Christian lays claim to the bodily Assumption of Mary in clear terms, nothing ambiguous here. Ephraim as well described Mary as having been glorified by Christ and carried through the air to heaven. We find witness as well in more patristic evidence in Timothy of Jerusalem, who tells us who he believed. He says that the virgin is immortal to this day, seeing that he who had dwelt in her transported her to the regions of her Assumption. This Christian was of the persuasion that Mary was immortal, as there were certain groups of Christians that held to this view or were merely aware that it existed. Indeed, Epiphanius gives evidence of such when he claims that it isn't known if Mary died or not. John the theologian says, "And from that time forth, all knew that the spotless and precious body had been transferred to paradise." John the theologian gives evidence of a tradition found in various Dormition narratives. It was also held that Mary's Assumption was a sort of miraculous transportation to paradise, a privilege of her, as John tells us, being spotless. Some narratives also claim that Mary took a tour of the heavens before finally reaching her eternal destiny. These novels, whereas not wholly historical in nature, were evidence of a widely held belief amongst Christians that Mary was assumed into heaven, body and soul, by God. Moving forward, Jacob of Sirug, writing either in the late 400s or the 500s, tells us that the heavenly assemblies led with their cries, "O holy," to the glorious soul of the mother of the Son of God. And he says that the seraphim surrounded her soul that was translated. Moving forward, we see more evidence in Evodius of Rome in a homily on the Dormition. We find as well in Gregory of Tours. He tells us that the apostles took her body up, placed it in the tomb, and waited for the Lord to come and take her up to heaven. Diateknos of Livius, Modestus of Jerusalem, Germanus of Constantinople. And we move finally to a fluent Greek speaker in John of Damascus. He tells us that it was fitting that the spouse whom the father had taken to himself should live in the divine mansions. We find as well this evidence in the Gregorian sacramentary. Indeed, when one says there is no patristic evidence for this, they are indeed incorrect about this. It is quite ironic that Alpha and Omega Ministries claims that the proofs for such a belief are not only not scriptural, but also unable to be found among the early Christian sources. Anyone that wishes to examine the quotes that I put forth would not only be surprised to find that none of them come after 1000 AD. In fact, none of them even reach the 9th or the 10th century. All of them predate the 11th century. Indeed, this is an ancient tradition and an ancient truth of the Christian faith.
Okay, Turretinfan, you now have your 10-minute negative rebuttal. You may begin when you're ready.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Mr. Albrecht, for making this an interesting debate. I presented in my opening speech the fact that there's no historical evidence that this took place. And Mr. Albrecht hasn't provided much in his first rebuttal. He has simply stated that it's not necessary for us to know the precise dates of things to know that they're historical. Well, and one of his points was something that we don't even have a dogmatic view of. We don't hold as dogma that Revelation, the book of Revelation, was written on a particular date or anything like that. And we only hold as dogma those things that are actually revealed in Scripture. So it seems like an odd kind of statement. We know that it was written because we have historical evidence that it was written. The precise date may be a matter of some question, and there's some debate over certain points, but we at least can give things like the general decade in which many things happened. But nevertheless, there is no historical evidence of the assumption. That's the bottom line. The earliest document that's out there the date is well established is the Pseudo-Miletus article that Mr. Albrecht has pointed out. He also pointed out a book, the so-called Book of Mary's Repose, but I think he'll find a lot of trouble in actually dating that to any specific date or even any century with any kind of reliability, because as he doubtless knows, it doesn't survive in its original language. It only survives in an Ethiopic translation, Ethiopian essentially. Mr. Albrecht pointed out that Juniper Carroll suggests that the decree that's traditionally assigned to Gelasius, and you would see that Aquinas, if I recall correctly, is one of the folks who would testify that it's to be attributed to Gelasius, may not have in fact been written by Gelasius. I haven't investigated to see whether or not Juniper Carroll says that specifically, but let's see what Juniper Carroll says specifically about this Pseudo-Miletus writing. He says, the account of Pseudo-Melito, like the rest of the Transitus literature, is admittedly valueless as history. As an historical report of Mary's death and corporeal assumption, under that aspect, the historian is justified in dismissing it with a critical distaste. So that's what Juniper Carroll has to say about the Transitus literature, the central piece of literature on which this debate turns. And it seems to be the literature with which those who in the 6th century begin to talk about the Assumption have relied upon. It seems as though the only writings of which they're not aware of this Book of Repose. The only writing of which they're aware is this Transitus literature, and they've mistakenly taken it at face value and repeated its views. In fact, the 6th century is important because that's the earliest that Mr. Albrecht is finding anyone that could be considered orthodox holding these views. He quotes to Timothy of Jerusalem as one of the first sources he cites, and that's somebody who we don't even know who he is exactly. We don't know what century he's in exactly. We're kind of puzzling over it, and the reason that he cited him is not because he's some kind of notable church father, but because he happens to be one of the earliest people